Okay, today's lesson is Unit 6, Lesson 5, Comparing Decimal Numbers. Okay, so let's do a little review. When we compare fractions, what is very important about our time when we compare fractions? What has to happen? Oh, thank you, Zane. I knew somebody would remember that. That's not what she said.
I said we the same amount of pieces inside.
Yeah, that's different. That's different than saying the same size. So what we have to do when we're comparing fraction is we have to make sure that the size of the pieces are the same. Right now, the first one is in halves, and the second one is in fourths. So what you're saying is they can make them the same number, but that, like, what if if I was comparing this to this? They're not, the wholes aren't the same. So if I broke this into fourths and this into fourths, they're not going to be the same size fourths, right? You have to make them the same size, you guys. That's the only way you can compare them. It's very key. And the same thing goes for when you're dealing with fractions. I mean decimals. You have to make them the same size in order to compare them. Okay? So let's look at the next slide here. The size of the pieces needs to be the same. Next slide. So we look at the first one on the very top. Can somebody read those decimals to me first? Anila, can you read those?
1/10 and 1100.
Ooh, very good. 1/10 and 11/100. Well, the way they are now, the size of the pieces aren't the same. The first one is in tenths, and the second one is in hundredths. So the second one's broken down into really small pieces, right? So let's turn that first one into hundredths, so that they're both hundredths. How would you read that if you turned it into a hundredth? Andrew?
Wait, sorry, what's the question again?
How would you turn the first decimal, 1/10, into a hundredth?
You add a 0 and then it becomes 110.
Just flip that around.
10
10 hundredths. So then we're looking at the same size, 10 hundredths and 11 hundredths. And you, at that point, can tell which one's bigger, which one's smaller, right? Right, 11 hundredths.
But don't you have to do that with the other one too?
It's already in hundredths, so it makes it easy for us. And decimals are really easy to make the same size. You just either add a 0 or you take off a 0. All right, so let's look at the next one. Can somebody read those to me? Yazzie, can you read those to me? 54 hundredths and 5 tenths. So we're going to make them both what? Somebody tell me. Nima? Hundredths. And how do you make the second one into hundredths? Go ahead.
You add a 0,
And then it becomes what?
500.
If you added a 0 to it, it would be 5 hundredths?
Wait, on the left side or?
Ooh, we're going to get to that in a second. Way to go. But hold on to that for a second. Let's go back. We added a 0 to the right side of the 5 tenths. At that point, what does it become, Shireen? 50 hundredths. So then we can compare the two. 54 hundredths and 50 hundredths. Which one's bigger, Aiden?
The 54.
Yeah, 54. So let's look at the last one. Can somebody read those to me? Ethan?
72,072.
Ooh, 72 hundredths, 72 thousandths. Some of you already passed doing this, and you're able to do it in your head very quickly, you know, making them the same size so that you can compare them. And you can just see which one's bigger. But, you know, for the rest of us that are just learning this, let's go ahead and make them the same size. One is 72 hundredths, the other one's 72 thousandths. Let's make them both into the same size piece. No, sit down. Let's make them into the same decimal place value. You know how to do it, Nicole?
Add a 0.
To which one?
The second
Second one, and then it would become what? 720 hundredths. Yeah. And that's compared to 7,200 or thousandths. So which one's bigger? Second one. Okay, next slide. Oh, that was my last slide, huh? Okay, so question for you. What happens if you add a 0 onto the end of a decimal, to the right side of a decimal? What happens to it? Tristan, what happens to it?
Like if it was in the tens, if you add a 0 to the end, it would become hundreds.
Good. Does it change the value?
No. Yes.
So let's look at the second one. We add a 0 to 5/10 up there. See it? The second number? And it becomes 50 hundredths. Is that the same as 5/10?
Yes.
50 hundredths and 5/10? They're both what? They're both 1/2. So it doesn't change the value of the decimal if you add zeros onto the right side. What if we added a 0 between the decimal and the 5? We added a 0 to the left side. Does it change the value?
It becomes 500.
500's good, and that's totally different than 5/10, right? Different value. So if we add zeros onto the left side, changes the value. What about if you had a whole number like 3, and you added a 0 onto the right side? Does that change the value?
No.
Who says no? Who says no? Raise your hand. Good. Who says yes? Okay, yeses. Jacob, tell me what it changes to. Right, so instead of 3, it becomes 30. What about if we have a whole number like 7 and we add a 0 onto the left side? Does it change the value? It does?
Yes.
What does it change it to?
7 hundredths.
A whole number. We have a whole 7,
Oh.
not a decimal, right? So we went from 7 to this.
Yes.
Does that change the value of 7?
No.
No, but if we add a 0 onto the right side, that changes the value for whole numbers. And then for decimals, if we put a 7 here and we added a 0 here, does it change the value?
No.
No, still stays 7/10, 70 hundredths. But if we add a 0 onto this side, that changes the value, right?
Yes.
Okay.
It's just simplified.
Very good. And that's it. That's it to this lesson. Decimal's pretty easy because it's only tenths, hundredths, thousandths. Super simple. Any questions?